Okay, let's open with prayer. Holy God, we thank you for this day, this beautiful fall day, and for this community that's gathered online to continue the study that's very important for us to see the ways that we participate and perpetuate racism and marginalization of peoples. I thank you for each one here, for our leaders and our participants, and pray your blessing on all, that we will have ears to hear and lives committed to making a difference. We pray this in all of your holy names. Amen.
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 Okay, it's all yours.
Do I see Linda Davis there too?
Yes.
Hi, Linda Davis. Okay, I'll write down all your names later. Did anybody have an overall feeling about this chapter that they would like to share?
I'd like to make a comment. I think it's very meaningful that we're reading and discussing this book just as Trump mentioned it as one of the most corrupting forces, and he specifically referred to this book.
Said that about our book?
Yeah, when he talked about, how we're not, ironically, he talked about how we're not teaching the students the right history, and it's the liberal teachers who are to blame. We should be teaching the history that promotes patriotism. He specifically he said books like, Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, even though I would bet money he hasn't read it himself. But I just finished a book by James Baldwin, who's a very famous Black writer, and he talked about, he put forward an interesting thought. He said that white people have a hard time owning their history, their actions in the past, and he said up until they're able to do so, the treatment of the Black people in this country will not change, because the Black people are this constant reminder of all the crime in the past, and we're not able, to acknowledge it.
What's the name of that book?
The Fire Next Time.
Uh-huh. Very famous book, though I haven't read it.
My husband's read most of Baldwin, so I'll have to see. The Fire Next Time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct. It's a really short one too, so it's.
Well, good, because this other one's really long. Okay, let's just start talking about, at the beginning, it's talked about the pontoon ships in New York. Does anybody know what those are? Well, I do, because I looked it up. It's where the Dutch East India Company, all the way back in the time, years before the Revolutionary War, gave like land grants to Dutch people. Okay, but all these people were getting rich off of it. I don't think our land grants make money too much in New Mexico. But then that was the anti-renters. Anybody want to talk about the anti-renters?
Well, let's start at the beginning, because you're talking about my ancestors.
Oh, okay. But I am at the beginning of the book, of the chapter. Aren't I, Ted? Oh, because
well, the Rensselaer Grant is actually a university, a technical school in Troy, New York, that carries that name. Was on the east side of the Hudson River, and it was the largest of all of these grants. And it was run for over 200 years by this family, basically as patrons. They were the hereditary bosses. Now, my ancestors were poor cousins that came over to manage it before the actual family came, and wound up being small farmers and what have you, gradually moving west.
Mention who they are.
Yeah, the Van Cools. But the 1624 settlement in Manhattan Island included all of these very substantial grants to these wealthy families from Holland. And the largest of all of them was the Rensselaer Grant, which was the one that this Zen book talks about the farmers finally revolting on in, what was it, 1829, I think, 26, something like that.
Yeah, you're close. So the this is what irritated me about that, no end. But this book irritates me. But it's really hard to read. It's hard to read, just because of what Katya was saying. It's hard to look at ourselves and go, "Ooh, those were our ancestors that did this." The thing is, when Stephen Rensselaer died in 1839, it was in the Hudson River Valley. He died, and he had let people not pay their rent sometimes. So I thought, oh, he's not such a bad guy. In his will, he wrote for all his family to go collect all those rents. So this family, it was over 500,000 acres. This family was worth $10 million in that time, which is 68 million today. And so he was going and grabbing all these people's pennies, and they couldn't keep the wood, the trees that were on their land. And they finally said, that's enough. And after 200 years, they said no more. Anybody else have any observations?
Well, this was a similar trend to the clearances taking place in England the century or two before, where the peasants, well, the whole area, where the peasants had rights to collect the down timber for their firewood, that which fell off the trees, the scraps. And our King James version of the Lord's Prayer got political here because the landowners were trying to stop this trespassing. So instead of saying debts or sins, they put trespasses in there to try to help stop these poor peasants from going in there and picking up this land, the lumber and what have you, which had been a right they had had for centuries.
Right. And that King James, he really did a number to the Bible. When I was in Bible college, I grew up on King James, and it was talking about, baptize. Baptize is not a translation; it's a transliteration, because he was walking the thin line between Catholics and Protestants. And deaconos, that's a Greek. And there's a lot of places in that. So that's another politico, trying to control even our faith. Okay, well, the thing that just blew me away was they were worth $68 billion, and they're putting the screws to these people who don't have $1 in their pocket. So that was irritating. And go ahead.
Yeah, it would appear that we haven't come too far from, Robin Hood, where the wealthy people in the palaces owned all the land, and somebody had to they collected from the poor, so Robin Hood had to reverse. I mean, how far have we come? Not very far, I don't think, at least then, and maybe not even now.
I think, Lori,
Very wise observation.
That makes me so upset reading this. Why haven't we come further? It's the year 2020. Are you kidding me? Okay.
Can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
The theological conference I was at this week, the keynote speaker said, people sometimes say it's 2020, why haven't we come farther? And he said, there's nothing magic about time. Show me the acts. Show me the decisions to change things, right? Time on its own doesn't change anything.
Right. I guess I think we consider ourselves so sophisticated. Why are we still looking at a Black person like they're a dog? That's ridiculous. And it's very, very true.
We've become very sophisticated in our racism and bigotry, where we can still be subtly, but very pointedly marginalizing.
Yes. Well, my favorite part of that that passage is when they were trying to, shoot the sheriffs, and they had some shootings and whatnot, and they went to court, and the judge said, okay, no need for more of this, do it politically. And then they voted, that group of people voted 14 anti-renter people into the legislature. I thought, there you go.
Laurie, Ryder, were you gonna share?
Oh.
Did you?
Just in general, I've been amazed to learn that systemic racism started from the beginning.
Yep.
I didn't realize it. I thought it wasn't until like the Civil War or something, but it was actually the beginning.
Oh,
It just became more sophisticated.
Yes.
Katya, you have your hand up.
Well, and to the question of like, why haven't the things changed? It seems like one of the central thoughts through the whole chapter is that every time movements were diverted into the system, like sort of doing things through politics, like go and vote, well, let your voice be heard, at the ballot box, including the union, which I find very interesting because I am a member of the union, of the teachers union, and it is actually kind of like very, very similar, because when the teachers strikes started a couple of years ago, or was it last year, the union actually did not endorse them. But then when they were successful, it came back and claimed them. And so the union today is, and it's a true criticism that, if I said it to our union leaders, would be denied, but it's so entrenched in just kind of lobbying and these like little details of the political system that it has stopped being like a real organizer of the people. And so, the system is designed so that it can stop the movements either by giving a little bit, like with the farmers and the strikes, it says, so it gave like a little bit, make them into like small landowners, but the basic structure of the rich and the poor, remained. Or, with the workers' strikes, it would just, annul the cuts or whatever, but it's really not becoming better.
Yes, but it's still Politico's trying to make us feel like we have a say. He actually said that in the next part where it's talking about Doors Rebellion. Well, I never heard of Doors Rebellion. I never heard of the Anti-Renters Rebellion. And he actually said around page 216, I don't know, somewhere in there, that these two movements were left out of US children's textbooks, as are most or any class struggle. And he said he wanted, or the leaders wanted to perpetuate a myth of heroes and hero worship instead of people taking care of themselves. That I grabbed out and went with it. And I feel like that's true. Do you still teach, Katya? What do you teach?
I teach literature.
In high school or junior
Yeah,
high?
high school, yes.
High school. Okay, do you have, go ahead, Lloyd.
Yeah, it seems to me that we haven't strayed too far from that today either, where so much of what we want to see is image, but not substance. We want to look good, but it doesn't matter if we're doing good. We just have to look good. I think Trump is all about that, always looking good, but is anything good happening? That's the question.
Yeah, looking. You gotta be able to.
Ted.
I want to deviate a little bit on this beginning of this chapter and his mentioning of the banking panics, because much of the unfettered capitalism, if profit is only social motivation, will inevitably result in time and again of a banking system collapsing. Much of this was corrected in the New Deal, but the present administration is endeavoring to disregard or repeal many of these regulations to protect not only the lower classes, but the middle classes as well. Therefore, the danger of a problem there has certainly increased in our country. The correction system has been weakened in order to protect or to benefit the most wealthy, and we're all potentially in line for some troubles because of this.
Some of that had already been repealed, which contributed fairly directly to the recession in 2008. Mm-hmm. And we still have neighbors right now who are finally getting foreclosed on. There's a house around the corner from us who's getting auctioned right now, but that foreclosure started a recession, and a lot of it was because they had already gotten out of those. And I when I was in college, I got to meet Paul Volcker because I was in the business college's honor club or whatever it was, and I got to pick him up at the airport and drive him. It was a long ways from Las Cruces at the time, and I'll think about the things that he said when they repealed some of that stuff. He warned people that we would have in 2008 happen.
Say that last sentence again. I didn't hear it. Please.
Paul Volcker was not in favor of some of the things that got repealed in the thousands because he feared the very kind of thing that we saw happen in 2008.
Oh, okay.
I think it's called GlassSteagall or something like that. There was some regulations that kept banking and investment separate. Banks and investment companies had to be separated. You couldn't be having the banks get in on, selling derivatives and that kind of stuff. And when they took away that separation, it created some of the risk that caused the recession in 2008.
Caused Sears and Lehman to go belly up. And even more of that removal of controls has continued in the last decade. Like I say, I'm spooky of it.
Well, and another thought here is that, people are not politically, they're not given a choice. So I'm quoting Zinn: to give people a choice between two different parties and allow them in a period of rebellion to choose the slightly more democratic one was an ingenious mode of control.
Yeah, I underlined that too. Did you mute yourself?
You're muted.
Atia.
Sorry, did you hear any of what I said?
No.
The first sentence.
Okay, back to, sorry. Howard Zinn says that another mechanism of control was having a system, the two-party system, that kind of locks people or leaves people without any choice. And he says that, where people are given the choice of the slightly more democratic party and having, that's an ingenious form of control. And since this chapter is about, economics, apart from civil rights, as a disenchanted Democrat, I'm gonna put forward the idea that in terms of economics, I actually don't think that, the Democratic Party today is, that much different from the Republican Party. It's also the party of the donors that refuses to run on the people's money only. I mean, even looking at things like Obamacare, which the Democratic establishment absolutely refuses to go beyond. And, even Joe Biden has said that if Medicare for all, passed the Congress and the Senate, he would veto it. And ultimately from Obamacare, all the money, the tax money goes to the insurance companies anyways. So like economically, there really isn't that much choice because the system is designed so that even if it does have to react to the movement, the reaction is absolutely minimal.
Another thing which has happened in this area is when there has been, and we'll get to it in another chapter or two, a genuine third alternative. In this case, the populist agrarian movement in the 1890s, which offered or attempted to offer a valid alternative to the two major parties, was eventually taken over by the Democratic Party. And this has happened at other times as well, that when a third position arises, quite often it's absorbed by one of the two major parties and loses much of its momentum and strength in this process.
Right, which all this reminds me of Andrew Jackson. When we read about, I went back and tried to review some stuff. I have to sit and read this book in front of the computer. So, okay, so Andrew, I know I have to look up everything. Andrew Jackson was our 17th president. He was called the People's President. And he destroyed the second bank of the US, and yet his face is still on a $20 bill. And he is said to have founded the Democratic Party. Is that right, Ted?
No, the parties have swapped names from time to time. He founded a rather, he managed to appear as a common man. At the same time, he was quite wealthy, slave trader, and very aggressive on grabbing Florida and what becomes in the next generation manifest destiny. Jefferson may have been closer to founding the Democratic Party, but you have the name. At one time, it was known as the Democrat-Republican Party versus the Whigs. Some of my ancestors, for instance, were Whigs that became abolitionists and Republicans that way. This stuff all shifts around, so you can't tag one label to a movement and it's still the same movement a century later.
Right. Well, the thing that jumped out that Zinn said, I looked up the Jackson stuff, and he was also the one to move all the Indians, the Indian Removal Act, and all the trails of tears.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
They wanted to grow cotton, get rid of the Indians so they could grow cotton.
So we can get richer. Thank you very much. But he never did that. I think it was Zinn we got this out of, that for policy making, he didn't go to Congress. He just made his own policy, and if they disagreed with him, he vetoed everything he didn't agree with. So
he famously lost a Supreme Court decision. The Cherokee sued to keep their land. The Supreme Court agreed with the Cherokee. Jackson was on record as saying, who was?
But Mr. Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it.
He refused a Supreme Court order in order to get rid of the Indians. This high-handed attitude was characteristic of Jackson.
And it's interesting to note that Jackson is the one that Trump admires the most.
Has on his wall and the whole routine.
Yeah, he's hung
really?
wall.
Well, makes sense. Makes sense to me. I'm God.
Just saying.
Just saying. I'm God. Okay, so anybody want to talk more about Andrew Jackson?
Oh.
Okay, let's go to the city growth. In 1790, there were less than 1 million people living in cities. By 1840, 11 million people lived in the cities. And then in the big cities, and he was talking about building factories and the second industrial revolution And the westward movement was helped because they had mechanization of plows. You know, they had the metal on the plow now that could do it 10 times faster and all those things. But in the cities where the poor people were, does anybody remember the conditions of the tenements?
Oh, horrid. Yeah, in 1871 with the Chicago fire, it said that the tenements just collapsed like dominoes. They were so badly built, you know, they just should.
Well, the concept of building on the quick is still with our society.
Yeah,
Our two eldest worked one summer in
Texas.
Plano area of Dallas, metropolitan Dallas, as gophers for a construction crew. And they were absolutely appalled at the shoddy construction being put up on these fancy new 2-car garage, 3-car garage homes, that everything was covered up with sheetrock and a coat of paint.
No, it's just like Katya said, all this stuff is still going on today.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, remember the typhus and the typhoid fever, and they had no plumbing, they had no water, and then of course the rich could import water from I forgot where, and that was in New York, I guess. And to heck with the poor people, they're dying. Oh well, Lori. Writer.
It's interesting that it's the same today. The poor people still have horrible conditions to live in, and they're more susceptible to illnesses. And the reservations don't have running water. It's madness.
Isn't that weird? I just think that's weird.
Yeah.
Well, even New Mexico legislator has not, has the majority, you know, of Democrats in the House and the Senate, they still can't pass the broadband bill, you know, because it would ultimately benefit, you know, the poor communities and the reservations, but there's no profit in it, so they haven't been able to pass it. And so, like in this situation today with all this distance learning, the communities that are negatively affected the most are actually, there've been several articles about Native American communities in progress now in New Mexico about how students don't have access to the internet, and, you know, students who live in poverty.
I know, it's really
just the reservations. We have some sections of the state are so remote. I had a high school classmate that graduated with 4 years of perfect attendance, having traveled 45 miles one way each day to and from high school, all those 4 years to maintain her attendance. 45 miles is a long ride on a school bus.
Ken had his hand up.
5 miles is a long ride on a school bus. I can't imagine how she did it. Very
Ken, you had your hand up.
Who?
We can't hear it.
Who?
I thought I heard a story, it might have been on NPR the other day, that part of the reason for the failure of legislation to provide more wide broadband access is due to the political influence of large commercial internet companies like Comcast and AT&T, who don't want that to happen.
Yep, unfortunately.
So the rich elite are still winning. You know, they started off winning and they're still winning.
Lori Rigler.
Miss Rigler.
What just boggles my mind is that this attitude, and it's not just in the United States, and it seems to have been existing almost from the beginning of time, is that I have to get all I can because there's only a limited supply and I can't afford to give anything away or I'll lose out. I don't know where we get that, because I would say it's not true. There's enough if we share, but we all have the attitude that, you know, I get the whole pizza and I'm not going to share it with anybody.
Yeah.
In terms of broadband or internet, we've tried to look into getting internet up there in at my mom's place in Chama. And yeah, you can get it, but it is exorbitantly expensive and certainly not something we can do for a place that we only visit, you know, and spend a little bit of time at. So, but what makes me worried about that when we checked into it is there's people that live there full time, and right now, what are their kids doing? Because it's internet up there is really expensive, really expensive.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Linda.
Unmute.
You're on mute.
All right, you're unmuted.
Okay. This takes me back to the very first chapter with Columbus. And when he came and landed on the island, he was introduced to indigenous people, and they took care of each other. It wasn't me and mine only. And we've never gotten back to that. That's what you're talking about, is I've got to hold on to mine. I've got to be sure that I've got enough. I can't possibly share with anybody else. And the indigenous people think the other way around. It's the good of the whole unit.
Yeah.
Amen on that.
And they do that. I worked at Sandia Pueblo for 10 years. And I can guarantee when my coworker, who was a member of the tribe, her husband went out and they did, some of them did a hunt. And when they came back, they had gotten I think it was a big deer. And she said, I'll bring you some of the meat. I'm not even a member of the tribe, but she brought me this huge package of frozen meat, and that was to share with me. And I wasn't even a member of the tribe. That's the way they think.
Well, we've been early on in our founding when there was so much early death and early starvation and early challenges as they started moving west. I think the scarcity began at the beginning with their fear of running out, of they're going to starve to death. And the rugged individualism of moving west across the continent caused even more, it's about me, it's not about us. And that perpetuates into today.
Right.
Well, I can see it going back to the Greek and Roman civilization and the elites there lording it over those who were serfs and slaves. That this is something we've inherited from our basic European civilization.
It's about power. I mean, excess is about power. I mean, there's just I mean, like the richest people in the world. I mean, there's only that much you can buy with money, but after a certain amount, money stops buying things and it starts buying power. And so it's about the accumulation of power. Again, James Baldwin talked about the idea of equality in our society. And he said, but what people forget is that there are a lot of people who don't want equality. In fact, they very explicitly want to be superior more so than they want to be equal.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's true.
Okay, let's move on. This whole thing about the city and the unions, the starting of unions, and how that many people didn't buy into the Civil War, which I was never told, because as Zinn says, who cares about people and people, you know, classes of people? We just care about being rich. And I remember a long time ago, it was David Eisenhower. I don't know, he was a rich guy from New York or something. And a journalist asked him, what's going to be enough for you? how much money do you have to get before it's enough? And he said, oh, just $1 more. And it was like, okay, it's never going to be enough for you. So I don't know. Eleanor, do you want to talk about all the union stuff and the rest of the chapter?
She wants to drop the rest on you on the union stuff.
I don't have to drop it. If you don't want to, I'll do it.
No,
Well,
I missed what I'm supposed to talk about here.
Well, I want to jump in again, if I
Yeah,
may briefly, is that we have a lot on Zen on the southern agriculture and the cotton, but the industrial change in the Northwest, we talk about the change of the cities, the Cyrus McCormick invention, the reaper. A single man in a single day went from 1/2 acre to 10 acres that he could harvest. And this sort of change was enormous. So you have in the farming community where they started industrializing, basically farming, you had taxpayers that voted, and this influenced some of the Midwest, whereas in the cities, the people and the tenants did not own property, therefore they did not vote. So you have a differential between the attempt of the unions in the cities versus the populist movement and this sort of thing on the farmers as to who had the right to vote. And this also influenced the direction these respective reform movements went.
Anybody have any comments about that? That all through the Civil War, they were fighting just to not do a wage cut. And
I want to talk about the union movement.
I hardly know anything.
Yeah, the United States in the North during the Civil War went through what amounted to a major industrialization shift, whereas the South was trying to restore the past. And this does not get taught in the history books. But the shift, for instance, from iron rails to steel rails was taking place in the North at the same time for the railroads, at the same time as the South, with the old iron railroads and Richmond being the only rolling mill left, were collapsing the transportation system. You have this incredible economic change taking place, that the North could be fighting this major war and getting richer at the same time because of industrialization.
Yeah, I knew that the North had a lot more industrialization, which helped contribute to winning the Civil War, probably. But you picture the cities as all on the same side working towards winning the war. I had no idea there was that much discontent involved underneath all of that.
Yeah.
You had draft riots. They could pay $300 and avoid the draft. You had immigration. I had an item about an Irishman being captured by the Confederate soldiers, essentially telling him to surrender as a Yankee, where he had been discriminated against for all of the time in the United States because he wasn't a Yankee, and he gladly surrendered simply because he was finally called a Yankee. This whole trend of immigration, of industrialization, of mechanical. By the end of the war, they were mass producing rifles interchangeably instead of having to manufacture them individually. All of this was taking place and never gets mentioned in the history books.
Yeah, one of the things that really surprised me, and I majored in U.S. history. I guess it didn't take very well because I was never that interested in it. I like ancient history, literally ancient, like Bronze Age and stuff like that. So the point is, I did not realize there was so much unrest in the 1900s or the 1800s. As I read this chapter, I thought, boy, rioting is an American pastime, it seems like. You know, our whole society has done this for years.
Yes, I agree. That's what I was just going to mention. All the riots, and I didn't realize they used lethal force on those riots. They killed women and children. They didn't care who they killed.
Yeah, it's a lot worse even than today, maybe. Looking at what's going on today, some people are getting shot and what have you, but it sounds like we're not even in the same ballpark with some of these strikes.
And the fact that that flower rebellion, they were destroying things that people could use just for the spite of it.
Yeah, that's too bad. That shouldn't even be.
Well, rioting is the form of bringing attention to a situation when going through the right means and the legal means is not drawing enough change. And so they resort to protests. And then when that's not bringing change, they resort to rioting. And then also you have the rioters who are actually trying to counter
unfortunately,
direction.
People that are destroying things are not the peaceful protesters. They're taking advantage of a protest to take attention away, really, from.
Well, I think it's a both and. It's not just the opposite. It is the action of those who are not getting the change that they have been seeking, and so they resort to extremes, just like the Watts riot. They were trying to bring change, and it was not happening, and so they resort to the worst behavior. It brings attention to it, but unfortunately, it often brings the negative attention.
The political system in which we live today, peaceful protest is pretty much innocuous. Like, to me, environmental movement is a good example of that, because there's like no sense in signing petitions anymore or standing, with signs. In fact, those in power ultimately, they don't care. That's where they want to divert our anger. And so today, disruption, which has become a term, and it's not necessarily the same as destruction, but it's kind of disruption is the only way to go about bringing about change, because simple peaceful protest, maybe with the exception of a boycott, is not effective anymore.
Ted?
Reminds me a little of the Boston Tea Party. This hasn't happened overnight.
No. Lori, writer?
No, say it's an American tradition.
Go ahead, Lori.
I was just going to say that, like today, Black Lives Matter is discredited because other people from other places came and destroyed things. And so Trump can just blow the whole thing off because of violence that happened also.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Well, we've seen that when people aren't hearing the message they want to hear, they can say, no, that's not the way you're supposed to do it. No, that's not the way you're supposed to do it. It's kneeling at the national anthem. No, that you can't do it that way. You got to do it this way. So then when you do it this way, no, you can't do it this way. You've got to do it this way. It's all like Katya's saying, it's about power and control.
Yeah.
So what forms, or what were the different forms through which working people manifested their opposition to their political and economic position? And what do they want? This is demonstrations, strikes, organizations, meetings, and finally, when nothing else works, riots, I guess. But we've had a long history of strikes and of labor unrest, most of which I understood were in the beginnings and later into the 20th century. Like I said, I was surprised to see how much happened in the 19th.
Lori, writer.
120 strikes.
Yes, this makes me wonder what's happening with the Poor People's Campaign.
The Poor People's Campaign has joined forces with Black Lives Matter because Dr. Barber says that it is not a moment, but a movement, and it all affects the poor. And therefore they partner together and bring awareness and march together even.
I just haven't heard much, like I've never heard in the media about the Poor People's Campaign.
Well, unfortunately, I think the occupant of the White House is carrying entirely too much attention in the media. I've gotten to where I don't even like to watch too much of it because it's all about him. And I listen
That's
to
how you won.
I listen to Dr. Barber separately, and so I do. I do hear him more often because I follow him on Twitter, I follow him on Facebook, and I listen to his sermons and lectures. He's he's part of our disciples' heritage too. He's ordained disciples pastor, so I kind of have a interest in him in particular for that too. Ryan?
Oh, just a second, Ryan. What's the guy's name that you follow separately?
Dr. William Barber.
Okay, thank you.
The founder of the Poor People's Campaign. He reactivated Martin Luther King's movement. Ryan?
Yeah, the thing about the Poor People's Campaign is that it's primarily organized and active at the state level. And so if New Mexico Poor People's Campaign isn't currently doing any activities, then we won't hear about it because it's a New Mexico, each state has its own chapter, and they occasionally have the big events like the June 20th event, sort of call everything together and raise awareness again. But yeah, and I had another idea, and since I've got the floor, Eleanor was talking about the strikes, and that's a form of the disruption that Katya was bringing up earlier. You have to do things that make people take note, right? So the garbage workers strike, I don't remember the date, but in New York, when your garbage starts piling it up, everybody will take notice because you've disrupted the ordinary way of life that people have taken for granted. The thing about oppressed and marginalized people is they're pushed to the margins. They become invisible. We don't see them on a day-to-day basis, and unless they disrupt the center, we can go on ignoring them. That's almost the very definition of privilege.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and we do it now. The blocking of 4-lane highways so that it gets on the news. That's a form of disruption that's nonviolent, but gets attention because it changed the way our ordinary life operates.
So you were going to say something, Ted?
Anne?
When I was reading about all these different strikes, it struck me how unhappy so many people were and how miserable and desperate. And you wanted there to be some sort of safety net, and maybe if they could have held on, if they weren't starving, if they weren't in tenements, maybe they could have had some success. I hope that, I don't know that as a society we have safety nets for people now, but you like to think, well, we have food stamps, we have, food banks, but it sounded like those people were desperate. And there was one example of a group of women who were pressing hot collars or something in a really awful place. And it was, desperately hot in the summer, freezing cold in the winter. And then people just sort of went around. It was inconvenient not to have pressed shirt collars. So then they started making paper collars so that they didn't have to deal with the issue of the people who were doing the ironing. I don't know how or if the churches at that time responded or tried to help, or, maybe there was the military intervened several times, or sheriffs or the government to kind of quash things. But it did seem like there were a lot of miserable people.
Laurie Ryder?
Am I on mute?
You're unmuted.
Okay. This question is for Ryan. How could I get in touch with the Poor People's Campaign in New Mexico?
You can also get in touch with Dr. Barber on the national level too. I'll give you the link to, it's repairers of the breach, or breach repairers. I'll have to look it up. That's his campaign nationally. And you can subscribe to his recordings there. And then, yeah, then there's the local one as well.
Yeah, I was wondering who is it locally that I can talk to?
Okay, Brother Ryan can have you something here.
Yeah, the email address from the Poor People's Campaign website is newmexico@poorpeoplescampaign.org. They also have a Facebook page if you're on Facebook. Between those two, you could probably start getting contacts for more deep connection and information.
And you can Google Dr. William Barber II, and find everything related to the Poor People's Campaign. Lori Rigler?
This isn't related to the poor people, but I think I had seen or read somewhere else that people were so desperate that sometimes they just leave their babies outside because they couldn't afford to take care of them. And if they were found, they were found. And if not, they just die. That's horrible.
Yeah. Or they'd leave them on the church doorway or something. Yeah. So, okay, looks like we're about out of time. Any other comments before we? Anybody?
Jennifer?
Well, there was on Democracy Now! In response to Trump's rant about, the people's history of the United States and the like. There was an interview with Howard Zinn from like a couple years earlier, which kind of, addresses the question of why that came up from someone earlier, like why isn't this taught? And I think there are two reasons. First of all, when you read about something like this, you see a pattern. Like you see a pattern that, the situation in which we find ourselves today is not an exception to the rule, that it is something that has been maintained over centuries, where, there are those who are in power and then there are powerless. And then also, and when you see a pattern, it's sort of like, you see that, like you need to fight against the, this kind of a division of power. And the second thing is like all those strikes and all that movement. And when I was reading about it, I was amazed at how many people came together. And that kind of sets a precedent that we actually can do something about it, that something people resorted to through centuries, like striking and boycotting and, trying to regain power. And Howard Zinn talked about, like he wasn't responding to Trump's message because he passed away, before the message. But what he was saying is that, like one of Trump's complaints was that, we're not honoring our heroes, which are like our founding fathers anymore. And what Howard Zinn said is that we need to find new heroes, and we have plenty of them in the history of our country, like all those labor organizers, etc. And those are the heroes that we need to teach or to talk about.
I put something about this on the chat box with the website, but the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship did an extensive bipartisan process across the country. We put together recommendations about how to reinvigorate our democracy. It's not very thick. They're free. You can get them for free, and this is a really good thing for people to look at.
Where did you get it for free? Where do you remember what?
I put the website on my chat box. If you go to the chat, I just put the website there.
Thank you.
Okay. You want to take over, Dawn?
Is there anything else that we want to cover today? Are we going to do 11 and 12 as individual weeks also?
I suspect so.
Yeah, the chapters seem to get longer.
And it's
Yeah.
supposed
11 is super long, but 12 isn't too bad. 12 is normal length, but 11 is super long.
Yes,
I just-
41 pages.
Well, we have the lecture is already recorded for 11 and 12 together, and it's scheduled to go public on Wednesday. So you can listen to just the part of chapter 11, and then we'll do chapter 11 next week. And then I'll leave it up. It'll stay, public, but I won't post 13 until 2 weeks. So you'll have 11 and 12 that you can listen to in its entirety or in pieces over the next few weeks. And we'll do 11 next week, 12 the following week. And if we
And
keep
then we'll
up
have
with
to
this
record
pace, we're going to be in 2021.
Yeah, and somewhere in here, you got to record the next one.
Yes. So does that sound like a plan? Is that what you'd like to do?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And I have Lisa's recording this coming week. I can do the next one for Ted as well. So then we'll stay ahead of the schedule.
Mine's on Thursday at 2.
I think it's Wednesday. Let me check.
I
We'll
wrote
do
it.
that offline.
Okay.
Everybody good?
Can I just ask Katya one more question?
Yeah.
What high school do you teach at?
I teach at it's called the Early College Academy. It operates along with the Korean Enrichment Center. It's an APS magnet school.
Oh, okay. Well, I wondered, do you guys ever teach, like when I went to high school at Manzano, or was it El Dorado? I don't know. They had a humanities class that put social studies and literature together. Do you guys have anything like that?
No, we don't have the blocks. It's a thought. Like one of our teachers wanted to explore that, but it didn't quite work out with scheduling and numbers, which is actually it's not an easy thing to do in terms of scheduling. So there was a proposal for this year, but actually not enough students signed up for the block. More students signed up for like separately, the history class and the language class.
Well, I loved learning history through literature and stuff, and that's how I taught my 5th graders. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Be well this week.
Next week.
See you next week.
Bye.